Your Excellency, thank you. So it seems to me that the title of the panel, which we formulate as the fall of the Soviet Union, is not very much correct in today's context. It should be so. Why? So it should be the why Soviet Union don't fall yet. And I think Vladimir Bukovsky, who is a prominent person and one of the people who just moved Soviet Union to the first phase of crashing, can just answer somehow this question.
Well, I don't know how much I will answer to that question. I remember 20 years ago when the Soviet Union disintegrated, this historic event was greeted in the West with total silence. I remember I was really annoyed by that. I mean, for 50 years at least, we were told that we are in a Cold War, that any moment we can have a nuclear holocaust, the world can perish. And yet when the monster died, no one celebrated. No one even noticed it. The politicians quickly claimed that we should not celebrate victory, it would be offensive to Russia. Why it would be offensive to Russia, I, as a Russian, failed to understand. I was the only one who celebrated. It was so annoying that I actually, to mark that event, I planted a tree in my garden. The tree happened to be a decorative cherry, a Japanese cherry. It blossoms every spring, but it doesn't bring any fruits, which I found a bit symbolic. Why was that? I mean, thinking about it in an objective manner, why did the West never try to investigate in a proper manner why the Soviet system collapsed? I mean, imagine if any construction collapses, a building, a bridge, or whatever, we would immediately have a commission which would look into it, establish who is guilty, why it happened, and obviously the other companies or countries would not try to build a similar construction on a similar design. Nothing of the sort happened with the Soviet system. It did collapse in a total silence, and no one tried to establish why. Actually, any attempts at establishing it by different countries, different individuals were greeted with hostility, or at least ignored by the media. I know that in Lithuania there was a tribunal on the Soviet system, and in some other countries there were similar attempts, but it never got an international attention. The West made its best to ignore the events like that. They don't want to look into the matter. Even today, when we, 20 years after it all collapsed, when we offer to media certain documents from the archives of Central Committee, revealing to the fact how it collapsed and how it functioned, the media is lukewarm. They just don't want to publish it. They're not interested. Although most of these documents are quite relevant to our time, particularly the role the Soviet Union played in international terrorism is quite relevant today. It shows how it developed. What is this terrorism we are talking about now? It's an amazing thing, which I'll try to explain in due course, why the West is so reluctant to study and to establish the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the absence of clear scientific proof or indication of how it happened created a certain vacuum, which was very quickly filled with all sorts of mythology. Today in Russia, you would meet more people who believe that, I don't know, that CIA undermined the Soviet Union and its collapse, then it has its own reasons for collapsing. You would meet people who would tell you a lot of mystical stuff about Russia's collapses, but no one would try to analyze what's actually happened. Most of the people would always say that it was unexpected, that no one expected it. Total nonsense. I mean, we did expect it in the 60s. A good friend of mine, who unfortunately is dead now, Andrei Malikov, published a book under the title, Will the Soviet Union Survive Till 1984? He published this book in 1969, long before it all happened. And of course he didn't mean the 1984 as such, he meant the Orwellian meaning of it. But nevertheless he got very close to the truth. The collapse of the Soviet Union started in reality in 1985. So he was wrong by 1 year, I would say. No one would ask a question, if someone could know it so much in advance, why didn't others try to understand it in advance? Why no one felt it inevitable? For us it was always quite clear and inevitable that the Soviet Union would one day collapse because it was based on wrong concepts. The basic concept of the Soviet Union was socialism. Now socialism is an unproductive concept. It's not about production, it's about distribution. And as long as there is something to distribute, the socialists can rule. But once they run out of what to distribute, they have a crisis. Someone quite aptly said that the socialists are the people who were bad students at school. And out of 4 mathematical actions, they've learned only 2. How to take out and how to divide. They never learned how to multiply and how to add up. So that's a basic mistake. And indeed, Russia is an incredibly rich country. It was always very rich with mineral resources, with arable land. It's a huge and rich country. And only in Russia, the socialist system could exist for so long. If you try to implement it in Sweden or in full capacity, not like they do, or in Switzerland, they would be bankrupt in 2 weeks. Russia could maintain this unproductive system for 73 years, which is incredible in itself. Now, the basic concept of socialist economy is a collective production, collective reward, and so on, which makes it impossible to create any intensive methods of production. So in reality, in order to produce more grain, they had to find more arable land in order to cultivate it. In order to produce more steel or electric energy, they would have to produce more steel factories and electric power plants. And in doing that, they were kind of expanding all across a huge territory of Russia with their unproductive enterprises, which would bring losses. Naturally, it would consume lots of energy, lots of labor resources and capital, and would bring sooner or later to bankruptcy. There were several times on the verge of bankruptcy. In the 60s, in the beginning of the 60s, they were on the verge of bankruptcy, and there were so-called Kosygin reforms, which were not much of a reforms. The prime minister at the time only insisted that enterprises should produce profit, not losses. That not very deep economic idea, nevertheless, was not accepted by establishment. Unfortunate for us, unfortunate for them, exactly at that time they discovered huge deposits of oil in Siberia. So suddenly there was no need for any reforms. They could continue to live as they did before. The same thing happened with grain. I mean, the deficit of grain in the country was very acute in the 60s. People couldn't buy bread. And Americans decided to sell grain to Khrushchev, to Soviet Union. It's amazing that Americans did that, but it's even more amazing why Khrushchev decided it's better for him to buy grain abroad rather than to produce it in Russia. Someone of his surrounding, his entourage, suggested to him that if we pay our peasants as much as we pay for foreign grain, they will produce it. But Khrushchev said, no, that's not good. That will create rich and poor. We can't allow that. So once again, the reason was political. So it's very little surprise that at the end they simply became bankrupt. But let's not make no mistake, they were not defeated, they were bankrupted. Apart from the obvious deficiencies of their own system of economy, they also have growing expenses concerning with their own foreign adventures. The objective of the Soviet system was to create the world socialism, to create the world socialist revolution, to establish socialism across the world, to liberate humanity from chains of capitalism. And very soon they discovered that the more successful they are in this endeavor, the more expensive it becomes for them. They were very pleased to have Cuba coming on the side of socialism, but then Cuba would cost them $10 billion a year. Vietnam was another great victory for socialist camp. They've got the whole region to themselves, and they defeated the United States in that struggle. But then Vietnam would cost them $12 billion a year. And so it went on. And nevertheless, they went to Africa, Angola, Ethiopia, Zaire, all these kind of new ventures made them more and more deficient. They finally understood that they simply cannot continue with this model, both inside and outside. The realization of it came to them in 1981, when in the course of Polish crisis of solidarity, they had to force the Poles to introduce martial law. Now the Polish leadership, Jaruzelski and the rest of them, were very happy to do it, but they wanted from Russia certain goods and certain services, certain support before doing that, in order to placate the people, so to speak. One of the things Jaruzelski wanted before introducing martial law was 30,000 tons of meat. Obviously, because the crisis in Poland started with shortage of meat, and workers made on strike, and strike developed into general strike. So Jaruzelski reckoned that if he introduces martial law, he should throw this meat into the shops and people will at least quiet down. Now, the Soviets could not muster this amount of meat. Every meeting of Politburo would be starting with Brezhnev saying, okay, comrades, what we have about the Polish meat? Gorbachev would jump up because he was a secretary for agriculture and would report, Comrade Brezhnev, we've sent the directive to all the obcoms and craycoms with your orders, and it's received everywhere with great enthusiasm. Brezhnev would say, well, that's very nice, but what about meat? Is there a meat? No, there is no meat yet. And so it would go from week to week, every meeting of Politburo, till December, when they had to introduce martial law. At the end, they didn't manage to get 30,000 tons of meat. They got only 16. So it just shows, and showed to them, most importantly, that their system cannot provide. It cannot be the basis of world socialism. Their economic base is too small for their political ambitions. So they had to do something. They had to change it. They had to freeze some areas where the hot spots were still continuing, revolutions still continuing, because they were afraid that once they stop advancing, they will start collapsing. There will be a domino system. So they had to have a certain rapprochement with the West, that the West would not push them further in these areas of Soviet expansion, They would also have an agreement with the West on arms cuts, which would release certain resources, and so on and so forth. They needed a period of good relations with the West. And that is exactly what perestroika was. Contrary to popular belief at that time, and partly even today, Gorbachev didn't invent perestroika and glasnost. He actually inherited it. It was worked out in many papers, research institutes of Central Committee before him. He only inherited it as the youngest, the most energetic, and to some sense charismatic fellow who could present himself on television without reading from paper, which was a novelty for Soviet leaders. So that was his advantage. That's why he was elected to perform this plan. And of course, the plan itself was half-hearted, half-baked, because it would never go further than socialism. Whatever they would suggest, and Gorbachev always underlined it, is within the framework of socialism. It should never cross the border of socialism. So he would allow the team contracts, the family contracts, lots of things, cooperatives, and only finally he came to the idea of individual labor activity. He still couldn't call it private initiative. That would be too much for him, but he would formulate it in a very kind of convoluted manner. And yet, he didn't have time to implement even that. So, but what was obviously too little for economy turned out to be too much for politics. And suddenly people felt free. They suddenly realized that repressions are not likely, so you can say what you think. In a sense, it was encouraged by glasnost, although very much controlled glasnost. Nevertheless, people would kind of use the opportunity to advance their own views, and it became ungovernable. He simply lost control. So what we had by 1991 is, on one hand, a complete bankruptcy of the economy, of the socialist model. On another hand, a loss of political control on the part of the Kremlin. That double problem finished off Soviet Union. It allowed Yeltsin to prohibit Communist Party and so on, but it did not defeat the Soviet system. And I insist on it, and I agree with you entirely, Mr. Landers. It was not a victory. It was not a victory. They were bankrupted. Imagine what would happen in Europe if in 1946-45 victorious allies would not insist on unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, but would suggest to accept some sort of perestroika of Nazi Germany. Someone from Goebbels' department would come up and become a chancellor and would offer the West good relations and things like that. What would have happened? We would have never released or liberated Europe from occupation. We would have never established any democracy in these countries. It would have been, like it's called today, post-totalitarian state. A very nice phrase which doesn't really mean much. It just means that there is no democracy in it. So that's what would have happened if the Allies at the end of World War II accepted some kind of reforms in Germany. And that's exactly what happened with the Soviet Union. The West accepted very happily whatever Moscow offered as a reform, as a concession, and never pressed any further, never demanded anything at all. The difference is very significant. If Nazi Germany was defeated and it had to reckon with what the regime did in Nuremberg trial, nothing of the sort happened in the Soviet Union. It did collapse. The old nomenclatura revived, still occupied the same offices in the same capacity, minus Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The rest continued. The KGB was never reformed. Not that they were named, but there was no serious reform. And the system continued. Now, we did try to insist on Nuremberg trial and the condemnation of a system as a criminal, on opening up archives and showing all the crimes this regime committed, on establishing the truth. What was the Soviet regime? How did it operate? What crimes it committed? And how did it end it? Unfortunately, Yeltsin's team was not ready for this kind of development. Well, to begin with, they themselves were part and parcel of the communist nomenclature. And although they were not personally implicated in any crimes, they did understand that at the end of the day, if you have a trial like that, they would hardly have a place in politics. Too much of affiliation with the former regime would taint them and would finish off their career. But that was not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, as far as I could understand at the time, was the objections of the West to this kind of a trial. Yeltsin and his leadership received avalanche of cables from all over the world, from the embassy, Russian embassies, conveying to them the extreme displeasure of the West at the prospect of opening archives and having this kind of a trial. So the West practically forced Yeltsin not to consider this option. I remember for a very short period of time, newspaper Pravda did not appear. It stopped to appear. It was not for very long. It was for a few weeks. But what an outcry was in the West, that it is infringement on freedom of press. And I had to defend Yeltsin's decision to Western media, explaining to them that Pravda was hardly a newspaper. It was a commanding organ. The Allies, when they came to Germany, did close Nazi newspapers, didn't they? Some Sturmvolks, or whatever it was called, some Beilbacher, whatever it was called. The West did close it down, and no one regarded it as a violation of freedom of press, because these publications were ideological, and they had to be completely reformed. Nevertheless, there was a big outcry in the West, particularly among the left-wing political organizations and parties, that Russian authorities are about to engage into witch hunt. It was called witch hunt, which was quite funny. I mean, witch hunt presupposes that there are no such things as witches. Well, in our case, our witches were quite obvious. We didn't need to hunt them, they were quite on the surface. And nevertheless, this unfinished business deprived us of a clear-cut victory. As we all know, in a few months the nomenclature revived and went into offensive. They complained to Constitutional Court of Russia about Yeltsin's ban on their party. They pushed further and further, promoting each other and occupying more and more influential positions, till at the end of the century they came to power again in the form of KGB. The worst possible part of Soviet nomenclature came to power and very quickly established it across the country. Since then, the observers reported that more than 80% of newly appointed people in the position of power in Russia were all with a KGB background. It's a complete takeover. It's today a corporate state controlled by KGB corporation. That is a very sad result of indecision and hesitance showed by Yeltsin's team. But what about the West? Now the West, the reason they so adamantly objected to any trial or investigation of the Soviet system became obvious to me when I got access to the archives of Central Committee. The degree of cooperation, secret cooperation, between the left and the West and Moscow was incredible. We always suspected it, but what we discovered was much bigger. Above all, I found very interesting documents when at the end of Soviet time, the Western leaders, particularly left-wing leaders, would visit Moscow, offer Gorbachev all kind of assistance, money and support, and would quite clearly, quite openly explain to him that they are not interested in the collapse of the Soviet Union. They want a strong Soviet Union. Because, as they say, and I quote, a collapse of socialism in the East will bring a crisis of this idea in the West. So they were concerned about their own ideology, their own position in the West, and not about us. And indeed, as we all could see, without studying how and why the socialist system collapsed in the East, they proceeded doing the same in the West, with the results which are quite predictable. Look at the European Union today, which in my view is just a pale copy of the Soviet Union. It was created with a view of uniting East and West. There was such a concept that one day the Soviet system will become milder and the West will become social democratic, and will be convergency, the theory of convergency. So that's why the European Union structures were built so similar to the Soviet structures in order to get them fitting each other very well when the time comes. And therefore, by adopting the same model and supporting the same ideology, they were just biding their time before the crisis would come. It's pretty obvious that it would have happened for us, but not for them. They didn't want to know about it. This is a very unfortunate turn of events. If we could persuade the leadership in Russia at that time to have this kind of a trial, the whole development in the world would have been different. We would not have a return to power of nomenclatura of KGB in Russia. We would have no Menshevik Soviet Union in Europe. We would have a massively changed situation. Above all, the liberalism, the idea of market economy would have been triumphant and implemented much wilder and deeper in the West. We would have been in a much better situation today. But that's what happened. So the end of the Soviet Union was not quite an end of it, as Mr. Landsbergis said. Those who had power managed to soften up this crisis, to help the system to transit from one stage to another, to mutate into another form safely, with no losses for themselves, practically, and they continue to operate today, both East and West. Thank you.